Now, right now, we don't have the means to really output a list here, since we will have to cover directives before we can do that, but we're almost there. We can at least prepare everything for outputting such a list. So what I will do is I'll create a new component, but first I'll navigate into my recipes folder. And here I'll again run ng generate component, or ng-gz, and I will create my recipe list component. This will create a new subfolder here, recipe list. I'll get rid of the test file again, as well as of the CSS file and of the CSS or styles import in the component itself. And here we will later on output the individual list items. So talking of that, that's a new class or new component I will create as well. I will create a new recipe item, and I will use the flat operator here. Oh, first I have to navigate into recipe list though. And then I will use ng-gz recipe item with the flat flag to not create a new folder, but instead store it in the same folder where I'm creating the list component. Also, I'm getting rid of testing file and the styles. And next, I want to output a recipe item here. And then later, I'll loop through all the recipe items and render this recipe component per item. So in the recipe component, or in the recipe item component here, I will have the actual code to display item. Whereas in the recipe list component, I will just have the code to loop through components and then create the individual item components. So that's the difference. Now, since me typing HTML probably isn't the most interesting thing to watch, I'm copying some prepared code in here. And of course, you find all the code attached to the lectures of this course, so of this project here. So as you can see, what I have here is basically an anchor tag wrapped around some other elements which make up such a list item as it should appear in the list. And I'm using Bootstrap classes here to give this some nice styling. I'm also using data binding to bind to the name, description, and the image path of a recipe. And I will come back to that in a second. In my recipe component body here, or in the TS, in the TypeScript file, I'll add two new properties. The recipe property, which should be my, recipe, and the recipe ID, which I will need later. Recipe, of course, will be the recipe I use throughout this application. And that is a great point to create a general class describing how such a recipe should look like in the first place. So before I continue here, I will create this class, and I will create it in the recipes folder. So I will navigate up one folder so that I'm back in the recipes folder where the recipes component lives. And I will create with the Angular CLI a new, simple class, a model. I can do this by typing ng and then g for generate and then cl, not just c, cl, and then the name of the class, recipe in my case. This will create a new file. I'll get rid of the test again. And in here, I can define how a recipe should look like in my application. Do this by adding a constructor where I have a name, a description, and an image path. Later, I'll also add ingredients, because a recipe will of course also have different ingredients, as will the shopping list have. But I'll come back to that. For now, this is my recipe, and now in the recipe item component, I can import this recipe. So I'll do that. Of course, I have to navigate up one file or one folder, import the recipe here, recipe. And with that recipe here, I can now say that the recipe I want to output as the recipe item here and the recipe item component should be of type recipe, because that will be my general recipe type throughout the application. And it's a very good practice, a best practice, and you should definitely do that to strongly type your properties. So recipe will be of type recipe and recipe ID will be of type number later. Now that being said, the recipe will not be loaded or fetched inside this recipe item component. Instead, as I explained, I will use my recipe list component to loop through an array of recipes and then pass the individual recipe of the current iteration to the created recipe item component. Recipe item component is created upon each iteration, and then I want to pass the current element to that newly created component. Therefore, and here data binding kicks in, or property binding to be precise, I'll make this an input, which means it's set from outside of this component here. I'll of course need to import input from Angular core. So with that, the recipe will be set but from outside, and from where? From the recipe list, of course. So let's go to recipe list. Here, for now, I'll have a recipes array, so of type recipe array, which should be empty at the beginning. And I'll of course import recipe here too. Have to navigate up, of course, too. And add it here. So now I'm importing recipe here, and I'm creating this array of recipes, which is empty, as you can see right here. And later I will implement some looping logic here. For now, what I will do is I'll also copy in some prepared code. Later, as you can see, we'll have a button to create a new recipe here too. And here in the unordered list, I'll later loop through my recipe items. Now, since we haven't learned it yet, for now what I will do is I will simply output one recipe book recipe item component. This is of course the selector set up in the recipe item component.ts file. So I'm outputting one, but no matter if I'm looping or not, I have to pass a recipe here, right? So for now, I'll create a dummy recipe, which I can pass, and I will delete this later. So this will be a new recipe. I'll give this name of dummy, description of dummy, and some nice image. Let's search for dummy to fit the theme here. Maybe something like, well, let's take such a fashion dummy here. So like this one. Deep linking, always good. Don't do that. So pass this as a string to this path. And then I can simply pass this by using recipe and referring to the recipe set up in this recipe list component. So in order to not go too fast here, what am I doing? I set up property binding in the recipe item component here, which means please give me the recipe from outside. Then in the recipe list component, which will be the outside to the recipe item component, since one list will have multiple items, I create for now one recipe item component with that selector, and I pass to the bound property recipe, this one here, the recipe of my recipe list component, this one. So even though both have the name recipe, the first one in the squared brackets, of course, refers to the property, to the bound property in the recipe item component, whereas the one in the quotation marks refers to the property in the recipe list component, this one, this dummy recipe. So I'm passing this to show something, and with that we're almost there, but we're not including the recipe list right now. So I will do that, and I will do this in the recipes component here. So here, where I'm currently outputting this dummy text, I'll instead output recipe book, recipe list. Now, what do you have to do if you want to use components, which are directives? You have to add them to the directives metadata. The same is of course true for the recipe list component, where I'm currently not doing that for the recipe item component. So I'll start here. I'll import from recipe item, the recipe item component. And add it to the directives metadata here. I'll do the very same in the recipes component here, where I also need to add the directives metadata for the recipe list component here though, because that's the component I'm embedding here, and I'll use my IDE to automatically import this. And I don't need to add the second part here if I make sure that all the components in this folder are added to this index.ts file, which I'm doing right now. So with that, if we have a look at the application, you can see the dummy item here, this new recipe button, which doesn't do anything right now, of course, and that is going in the right direction, I'd say. Now regarding the recipe detail, let's have a look at that.